Pete Thamel, kind enough to join us on loan from Yahoo Sports, their national college football reporter. And I'm not sure what's happening in college football. I know there's a lot going on off the field there, Pete. I don't know how much we're going to have on the field, but give me the Cliff Notes version of what's going on with the Pac-12 right now.
Sure, Dan. The Pac-12 basically had a player-led movement that manifested itself this weekend with some online demands, and they ranged from the very pragmatic and realistic to consistent health and safety protocols to 6 years of insurance after a playing career ends, to the somewhat more unrealistic of half of essentially the football revenue from the Pac-12. They also asked the commissioner and coaches to take significant pay cuts to help support them. So it was about, when you really step back from 30,000 feet and look at it, what you'd expect from a disparate group of 18 to 22-year-olds from 12 different schools, with certainly varying, coming from varying places, kind of trying to band together and make some change. There was some positives. Some of the stuff gave you a little bit of pause, but I think generally my takeaway is it really created some positive dialogue. And the column I wrote for Yahoo today basically says, look, this is a window into where we are going forward in college sports. When we mercifully put the pandemic behind us and it's 2021, all of a sudden, you're going to have name, image, and likeness in college sports, Dan. You're going to have free transfer and the voice of the player through social media and being less restricted by their coaches, as we've seen from the player empowerment movement the past couple of months, is really going to change the whole landscape of how college sports look and operate.
They had me up until we want 50-50 rev share here. Because the other part of this, and I agree, we forget about college football players after they graduate, if they graduate and they don't go into the NFL. We use them and then we move on because here comes the next, group of athletes here. How many athletes are involved in this? And have we heard from any other conferences yet in a show of support?
So it's a great question about the number of athletes involved, because they casted in their releases hundreds, but when you start calling coaches and ADs in around the league, most places are like, we've got 3 or 4 guys, and there's a key line of demarcation, and that I think is going to define this movement this week, Dan. There's the support for the spirit and the tenor of the movement, which is support athletes' rights and privileges, and then there's the I'm going to sit and opt out of games in order to achieve this. And we have very little clarity right now about where that line is drawn. And a couple of young men in the Pac-12 very, very articulately said on Twitter, Elijah Molden at Washington being one of them, look, like, I support these things, but at the end of the day, I need to go play. And that's, I think, where a lot of this is going to come down to. So I'll be very curious to see. I think the Pac-12 is going to engage on this to a healthy level. But another, I think, mistake they made is they actually haven't approached the Pac-12 or any of the schools yet. They've simply just put their demands out there in media, which, well, you know how negotiations for the media tend to go over the years. Dan, you probably talked about that once or twice on your show.
Yes, I have. I start to look at the state of college football, and as optimistic as I want to be, it's really hard when you add realism, just being pragmatic about this. I don't know if the Big Ten is going to play football this year. The SEC, it feels like, hey, we're the SEC, we will play. The ACC, it feels like that. The Big 12 feels like that. I don't know about the Pac-12, but the fact that the Big Ten, they're holding internal conversations about if they can pull this off. When are we going to – is there a date? Like, are these conferences, schools going to have a drop-dead date here, Pete?
Here's the bottom line, Dan. They're waiting for the decision to be made for them. They're waiting for an MLB to fall apart. They're waiting for some seismic act that's going to make this obvious. But right now, the plan is, I've joked in columns, push, and hope. Let's just push things back and hope things get better. Hope the environment gets better. Now, you talk to some coaches, they'll tell you right now, after having had their kids on campus for 6 to 8 weeks and having very few positive tests, they feel as good as ever. Like, they'd love to start camp soon. And that, I would say, is probably the tenor at about half the schools. The untenable variable, Dan, that I really think everyone is sitting back and bracing for, and nobody has a good answer to, is what happens when students come back. And that starts to happen as soon as the next couple of weeks, because a lot of the schools in the Northeast Big Ten footprint are starting in early August, so they can leave by Thanksgiving to reduce travel. When you bring 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 students to campus, the virus is going to come with them. And I really think that is going to be the fact that exposes an unbubbled option like we're seeing in Major League Baseball.
He's Pete Thamel, covers college football for Yahoo Sports. I was wondering about college football campuses. I remember being on the basketball team. We had a basketball dorm.
Mhm.
Can you create a bubble for these football players where they have their own dorm and maybe they're not going to classes, physically going to classes, but you do it remotely, but you're there. They know why they're there. I know that they want to get an education, but let's not kid anybody. If you want to quarantine them, put them in a bubble, and have restrictions like you do with NBA players, is that possible for some of these big-time schools?
I think it's possible. I also think that's fraught with some ethical and optical issues. The irony is camp, which is has started at places like Oklahoma and Kansas on Friday, tends to be a bubble situation. Guys go to a same dorm, guys go to a hotel. Like there is that, and with really few other students around, it's very feasible. But for a school to come out and say we're essentially locking our guys in a dorm or locking our guys in a hotel so they can play football, I just really don't think optically that's going to fly.
What is the oddest option you've heard so far?
I mean, you do hear a little bit of everything. Some people saying, well, we try to play 3 or 4 games in the fall and then maybe try to play, the rest of it in the spring. Like that's been a
split season.
Yes, a split season. I would say that is the strangest.
Yeah, and if I'm a player playing in the Big 12 or these Power 5 conferences, I don't want to play in the spring because you can't have 2 college football seasons in a 9-month span. I just don't see that working. I do think that these smaller schools, smaller conferences will opt for the spring because that's wide open for TV, for eyeballs on your sport, on your school. And a lot of those players aren't going to be going to the combine or getting drafted. So I see that. I also brought this up. A source yesterday said, you're going to get your wish. The Power 5 is going to eventually secede from the NCAA. And I said, it's not my wish, just my prediction. He said, it's not a question of if, but when. That the Power 5 really has no need for the NCAA. When do you agree with that?
I think that has long been kind of a Final Four bar conversation, but there's billion-dollar television contracts that look, college sports are really bound by television contracts, right? The college football playoff is a television contract.
Yep.
It's not like an entity. It's just one guy runs it, and it's a multi-billion-dollar TV deal. The conferences are linked by that. The NCAA exists because of the multi-billion-dollar TV deal. Here's the thing: if all these schools broke away, they're not all of us going to sudden start paying the left guard at Toledo $30,000. Like it's still going to be some other form of amateur athletics. The NCAA has been underwhelming. Mark Emmert has clearly been underwhelming in all this. He's been basically invisible. And I do feel like that is coming to a head. When people do say there is a breakaway, my question to them is, well, what does that breakaway actually look like? Like, say you didn't like the accounting department at your Fortune 500 company. If you got rid of them, you'd still need an accounting department. And that's essentially what the NCAA is. 95% of it is championship running, backroom work, be it enforcement, compliance type stuff, etc. And a majority of that is fairly functional, more functional than we probably give the NCAA credit for. It's the high-end leadership and the difficulty of managing a system that has Maine and Miami under the same set of rules where they've really struggled and obviously not adapted.
Pete, good to talk to you. I have no idea. If I talk to you in a month from now, what's the headline?
I want to give you the other odd option. I've been joking with the coach about the New Zealand Nova Scotia option where there's no virus. If they could move like all the conferences to either New Zealand and Nova Scotia.
Wait, you didn't use that as the craziest option you
I know.
heard.
It took me a second. It came to me though. Yes. So hopefully I'll see you in Auckland in a month from the show here.
Well, I've been to Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, but I don't know if they have the facilities there in Nova Scotia.
Just make it work. Like Ortron said, we'd line up in a pasture at midnight.
We'd line up in a pasture at midnight. Pete, thank you, buddy. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dan.
That's Pete Thamel, covers college football for Yahoo Sports.